So once again, let's sort of take a moment to sort of take a breath and to gather ourselves. The poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote that the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Through poetry, plays, fairy tales, and the evening news, stories shape our personal, cultural, and historical narratives. They are natural manifestations of our human need to make sense of things, of our values, how we belong, who we are, and how we act and shape our world. The challenge is not with our stories, but how we engage and act out of them, not understanding or forgetting the larger narratives that also shape our world. We may forget or not see clearly that all stories have a point of view and become blind not only to other points of view, but to the narrow stance of our own and creating separation with each other and with the earth. We may also not see the earth or the world as it is in itself, and that we too are shaped by it, by the impersonal, unfolding dynamic of the universe, where the narrative of ourself, the who we think we are, is also a story of our impermanence and of our interdependence with each other and all things. And therein lies the possibility of our freedom, the insights of the Buddha in his discovery of the middle way that can liberate our narratives of hunger and separation through embrace of the wholeness of our experiencing, to restore and reshape our lives through a wise, ethical, and compassionate response to each other and the world, freeing us to the possibility of seeing what is also here, the richness and abundance, in the words of Stephen Batchelor, of the everyday sublime. There was a time as a young child, age 5 or so, when my mother was very seriously ill, that my dad, a merchant sea captain who had to stop sailing and take work as a night's watchman on merchant ships moored at dock. It was a time of great uncertainty and austerity. But as someone who had been old enough to be my grandfather, who'd gone to sea at age 14, became a ship's master at age 23, and ran supply runs through 2 world wars, he was a man of many resources, full of ease and humor, who took delight in play and the laughter of children. So depending on the weather or the mood of the moment, our apartment became play central, a safe haven better than the street where my dad could watch as he'd prepare meals for the week, while those 6 or 7 of us jumped, squealed, turned the furniture upside down, or shot at him as the pirate or the sea monster in the pure joy and mayhem of play. And when all was said and done, and it was time to pack up and go home, after uprighting the furniture again, my dad would take out a tall jar filled with bright, hard, rainbow-colored candy, a jar that made our eyes glow big, and give us what he called the screaming memes. The jar was big enough to push our hands deep into the center, to grab as much as you want, he'd say, but the mouth of the jar was not big enough for any of us to squeeze out more than 2 or 3 pieces. Those with big hands dropping candies along the way, and those of us with small hands not able to grasp very much in the first place. But somehow it evened itself out, with my dad skillfully navigating the screaming memes, our eyeing and mine, and saying as we'd push and dig deeper, clinging to whatever we could hold, that enough was as good as a feast. I used to think, over the years, I thought that expression, enough is as good as a feast, was my dad's, until I read a novel by an Irish-American writer and discovered that it was actually a phrase spoken by the Irish, an old proverb pointing to the virtue of moderation in all things, as well as eating. A saying natural to a people and their memories of oppression in the past, having to live under the yoke of another, yet always having enough to eat and facing the real possibility of starving, as the Irish did during the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s, when men, women, and children died by hundreds of thousands. From a Buddhist perspective, enough is as good as a feast also points to the wisdom that Siddhartha Gautama was to experience before he became the Buddha over 2,500 years ago, after practicing the most severe austerities, starving and punishing his body. Weakened and very close to death, with his skin withered and clinging to his skeletal frame, Gautama accepts a bowl of rice milk and porridge from a young woman, Sujata, as she passes him sitting on the bank of a river. Seeing Gautama drink from the bowl, his fellow renunciates are disgusted and shocked, and taking it as a deep betrayal of their ascetic path, abandon him as a failure and a fake. But as the energy of the porridge begins to course through Gautama's body, emaciated body, he has a memory of himself as a young boy, sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, resting in the joy and peace of his first meditative absorption, while his father, the king of their Sakyan clan, pushes a plow and breaks ground in the first ritual spring planting of the year. And as the peace and the joy of that memory fill Gautama's body with renewed life and possibility, a new question also arises, which, like his father's plow, is also to break new ground and dig afresh into the heart of the matter. Is this, he asked, the possible path to awakening? The middle way where mind and body, poised between stories of wanting and not wanting, driven by desire and craving, feeding a deep existential hunger and thirst of greed, hatred, and delusion. What my dad in his humor called the screaming mimes and not enoughness, as we jostled each other with sticky fingers and tightened fists. Is this the possible path, Gautama asks, where mind and body can rest in the center of a wakeful, open, and receptive stillness, where we can see more clearly into the nature of our grasping and clinging, and in that tender, balanced wakefulness, without clinging to preferences, begin to let go of that reactivity, to open the fist of the mind and let be, in full surrender to the direct experiencing of what is, the moment-to-moment unfolding of the present, and the completeness and abundance of that, the enough that is as good as a feast. Whereas humans, we can taste not only the delicious freedom of each moment's release, but the possibility, breath by breath, of our release from suffering itself, the feast of awakening. With the energy of his mind and body restored, coming home to his body and holding the question of the middle way as the possible path, Gautama places his empty bowl into the river and, watching it go against the stream, finds his resolve to sit and not get up until he can live fully into the answer, into the question of what is, into the nature of suffering, in the possibility of its cessation in this world. Sitting under the banyan tree through 3 watches of the night, Gautama is then assailed by Mara, by all the delusions and hungers of mind and body, and discovers, resting in equanimity, that the middle way is the path. And as he reaches down and touches earth lightly with his fingertips, the earth breaks forth with a lion's roar, holding him and bearing witness as Gautama now becomes the Buddha, the one who knows, who is awake. And the banyan tree becomes the Bodhi tree, with its roots deep into the earth and its branches outstretched to the sky, a symbol of the awakened heart-mind and its connection with all things. But before this awakening, Gautama is confronted by a different question, the last pitch made by Mara, when no delusion will take hold. The question of Gautama's presumption and authority to see through delusion and know the truth of things. The question in essence of, who do you think you are anyway? The question that the earth answers itself with a thunderous lion's roar that dispels all doubt and vanquishes Mara. Touching earth and living into the answer of the resounding yes with the lion's roar, of the earth's bearing witness, the Buddha now sees clearly with full comprehension the what is that has always been here, fully visible here and now, within himself and in the world. That craving and attachment will lead to suffering, to the stickiness of greed, hatred, and delusion. And that compassion, feeling into the fire of all that, will naturally respond with a willingness to let go and let be, breaking the power and enchantment of Mara. And that impermanence and our knowing that what has the nature to arise also has the nature to cease is both the bad news and the good news. That with the cultivation of compassion infused with the impartiality of equanimity, we can rest in the stillness and let whatever is pleasant or unpleasant come to its natural fruition, where it, if uninterrupted, it will cease of its own accord. The Buddha's insights are profound and exquisite in their simplicity, but clearly not so simple in our own ability to embody and realize them, especially if we lose sight of or have felt the terror of the groundlessness of it, that our ordinary storied self, shaped by our personal, social, and historical narratives, is not only impermanent, subject to the arising and ceasing of each moment, and to the larger arc of our life of illness, old age, and death, but is likewise compounded moment to moment as our consciousness makes contact through the sense doors, and that what we see, think, feel, and believe to be true emerges out of interdependent causes and conditions co-arising. So the last question that Mara throws at Gautama, his last thrust to unseat and pierce him to the core, questioning the very authenticity and authority of his personhood, Mara's question of, who are you, cannot be answered solely by the Gautama himself, because in that moment and in the unfolding of all moments, he knows with an awakened humility that he too is compounded of the earth, the four elements, the stuff of stars, and of the full May moon rising that night. That he too, or that he is, a self and a non-self, and by touching earth also awakens to the profound mystery, abundance, and feast of that. Zen Master Dogen says, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be enlightened by myriad things. This is the Buddha's story. And although we may be able to grasp it intellectually, it still may be very hard to get our head around, although it's our very head that we need to get out of and back into our body, into full, deep embodied engagement with what is pleasant, unpleasant, and uncertain. Entrusting ourselves to the waves and the words of Zen poet Ryokan, to the roiling narratives of our lives that we can ride with full presence and embrace for their transformation and liberation. When we open tomorrow's question of who do we think we are, our own story may be more like Alice, or if you prefer, Alex in Wonderland. Another child leaning against a tree, not awake in a deep meditative absorption, but asleep in a dream, where suddenly she finds herself chasing a white rabbit with pink eyes, wearing a waistcoat, anxiously checking his pocket watch, and racing after him, falls down a rabbit hole. "Who are you?" the caterpillar asks Alice, sitting on his toadstool, blowing smoke rings. Who, indeed, Alice wonders, having grown larger and smaller, drinking from magic bottles and eating small cakes, with her body telescoping up and down, and now standing eyeball to a toadstool, 3 inches tall, talking to a caterpillar, smoking a hookah. "I hardly know," she answers, "just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." The self that we most often recognize, the one that we see through the looking glass and others may know, is of course very real, as well as a story. It is unique with individual variations of gender and race, with different interest, preferences, and talents, born into a specific time and place, a family emotional field, and the cultural and historical pinnings that shape its becoming. It is also the self that suffers, born or created moment to moment through the co-arising of causes and conditions, and through the reactivity of our grasping and clinging, whether clinging to the past or leaning into some dream of the future, falling down a rabbit hole, chasing a white rabbit, holding on to our watch, not able to be present, to let go, to simply be with what is, right here, right now, as it ebbs and flows, whether it's a sorrow or a momentary joy, through wanting and holding on, or not wanting and pushing away. The waves of eyeing and mying, and of judging, comparing, and fixing mind that inflate and deflate us like Alice when she eats the hallucinogenic mushroom, where one side makes us large and the other small, and our attempt to find some ground, some comfort, and some deep certainty, swinging between identifications of being superior or inferior, of being an insider or an outsider, of being important or not important, ripped about by the 8 worldly winds, pleasure and pain, praise and blame, fame and disrepute, and gain and loss. So, before we can live more fully into the embodied answer of the question, who are you, we might simply ask, what's this? What's here? What's happening now? Questions that embrace doubt and uncertainty, not as a corrosive doubt about oneself or of one's authority to know and to awaken, the doubt Mara flung at Gautama in his last attempt to unseat him, but what in Zen they call the great doubt, the uncertainty and patience of beginner's mind, the humility of not knowing, where we can rest and stay open, present to the ground of possibility, becoming curiouser and curiouser, in the words of Alice, as we ride the waves, buffeted by the winds, falling down rabbit holes, and yet held aloft by the updraft of an open, receptive, and tender curiosity. Torquing, it's a great word, torquing each of the Four Noble Truths into the Four Noble Tasks as a task-based ethics, to let go of reactivity and wake up out of the dream of a world and of oneself as solid, unchanging, and mine, to the truth and freedom of what is. Stephen Batchelor gives us an acronym, ELSA, E-L-S-A. E, to embrace the tragic dimensions of everything. L, to let go of reactivity. S, to stop and see clearly. And A, to act where we can shape a non-reactive, ethical, and compassionate response to each other in the world. E-L-S-A, ELSA, sounding as if it could be the name of one of Alice's cats, like her kitty, who wakes her up out of the dream that she has also entered through the looking glass. To embrace whatever arises is to come home to a deep embodied presence and to an equanimity that infuses loving kindness, compassion, and appreciative joy with impartiality, where with a loving embrace we can feel deeply into the heat of our clinging, the fire of our wanting or not wanting and delusion. A fire that many years ago I found myself sitting in the middle of when journeying with my elderly aunt, who had been a mother to me, but who had moved back to England, where she lived with a cousin, and now well into her 90s, wanted to travel back to Scotland, where she'd been born, a journey I knew that very likely would be our last. My aunt, like my father, was very open, gregarious, and kind, and despite living on a fixed income, gave to others what she could. But as other aunts had shared, giving sometimes to a fault, not just to support a cause or to help a stranger in need, but as it seemed out of some lifelong insecurity to be needed and loved. As a young girl who had to make her way through the world with very little education and great heart, but not believing that she herself was enough. So, taken advantage of by some. And seeing her now, after she'd had some mini strokes, some TIAs, how she could still walk wobbly with a cane, but not as able to distinguish between a 1 pound and a 5 pound British coin, with some folks being kind and fair when they made change for her, and others hovering and overly solicitous for tips, offering to escort her here and there. So my sadness and my anger, how her aging had taken hold, and how it had increased her vulnerability, and in my own experiencing of that, how it had increased my own. And so I sat in a room with a view on the top floor of an aging grand hotel where Londoners of the past century took trains to vacation and soak in hot baths. But all I could see or feel as I sat in meditation was the story and heat of a pending loss, falling deep into a rabbit hole of overwhelming grief, and trying to hold it as if it were a child, as Thich Nhat Hanh had taught, embracing it as I could with loving presence, entrusting myself to the roiling waves and letting them be until the energies of fear, anger, and sadness could eventually cease, and a clarity and a peace could arise. The next morning, my aunt and I rode the bus, traveling further west through the northwest highlands over twisting roads, up and down hills, with stunning views of mountains, deep gorges, and lakes that filled us with awe and rendered us silent, knowing that we would never be able to take this trip together again, but with a greater acceptance and peace now in my heart, and with a glimpse as we journeyed further west and then back home again, of the everyday sublime. Stephen Batchelor writes that the experience of the sublime exceeds our capacity for representation. The world is excessive. Every blade of grass, every ray of sun, every falling leaf is excessive. None of these things can be captured adequately in concepts, images, or words. They overreach us, spilling beyond the boundaries of thought. Their sublimity brings the thinking, calculating mind to a stop, leaving one speechless, overwhelmed with either wonder or terror. Yet the human animal who delights and revels in her place, who craves security, certainty, and consolation, the sublime is banished and forgotten. As a result, life is rendered opaque and flat. Each day is reduced to the repetition of familiar actions and events, which are blandly comforting, but devoid of an intensity which we both yearn for and fear. To experience the everyday sublime, Batchelor goes on, one needs to dismantle, piece by piece, the perceptual conditioning that insists on seeing oneself and the world as essentially comfortable, permanent, solid, and mine. It means to embrace suffering and conflict rather than to shy away from them, to cultivate a radical attention that contemplates the tragic, changing, empty, and impersonal dimensions of life, rather than succumbing to fantasies of self-glorification or self-loathing. This takes time, he says. It is a lifelong practice. It is the practice and the story of the Buddha, of his coming home to his body and touching earth, in his embrace of the middle way, and deep embodied awakening by the myriad things. The story of his quenching of hunger and thirst, of asking questions of what's this, what's here, and of his surrender to what is with wondrous humility, living deeply into the answers to restore and shape a wise, ethical, and compassionate response of doing no harm to himself, to others, and to the world. It is also the story of the possibility of our own awakening and deepening humility in moments, big and small, when we let go of the fist of our mind and the reactivity of our screaming mimes and entrust ourselves to the waves in the flow of our becoming as impermanence. And in the words of Zen Master Dogen, in the flow of our being as being time, with each moment the universe, where enough is not only as good as a feast, it is the feast of awakening itself. And with the forgetting of self, the discovery of the Buddha, that we are both empty and full, where through new stories, in the words of Sri Nisargadatta, wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I am everything. Between the two, my life flows. So, taking a moment now to regather again. In our own deep, embodied presencing to also what is here right now. And may the gifts of our practice this evening, at home and at all times, bring benefit to ourselves, to each other, and to our deepened connection with the world. Namaste.